Mouthwashing is one of the most disturbing games I have ever played. It is a game that digs into the back of your mind, whether that be through your ears, your eyes, or your brain. Through its short 2 hours of runtime, it will plant itself deep in your head with the goal of never leaving that small space it has carved out for itself. This video will spoil that experience as I talk about the story and its horror, so I suggest you go play it or watch a playthrough of it and then come back here. Also, content warning for the things on screen, this game gets pretty heavy, so make sure you're ready for that. The game starts out with a screen displaying some basic information, as the sentence "I hope this hurts" appears. We cut into a spaceship with an automated message telling us we need to steer slightly left to avoid an asteroid. But when we interact with the steering mechanism, we only get the option to steer right. When we do, the autopilot gets engaged, but we disable it, and as alarms blare, we leave the cockpit into this tight hallway as it contorts and corrupts, pipes blocking the way as the company mascot chases us through the halls, closer and closer, until impact. This is the narrative structure the game will follow most of the time. A scene happens, and right before or right after we see the results, time skips forwards or backwards and we get thrown into a new scene. This structure leaves you in a constant state of disorientations as scenes fade into one another sooner than you would want, sometimes months apart from each other. These scenes usually don't see too much action. The main gameplay of this game is mostly walking and reading dialogue. Then sometimes you get a scene like this. And these scenes have something to say, but on your first playthrough you probably just interpret them by vibes. And the vibes... I'll get into those later though. For now we can find the results of the intro sequence with Curly, the ex-captain, completely burned. And the implication is that he is the one who crashed the ship. We also get introduced to the rest of the crew with Jimmy, the guy that took over the captain role after the crash, Anya, the nurse of the ship, Swansea, the grumpy mechanic, and Daisuke, the intern who's mostly here to be a victim. This scene is 2 months after the crash, and Anya can't take the noise Curly makes anymore, so she asks Jimmy to administer the painkillers for her. After he demeaningly questions her role, he asks her why they even bother to keep him alive, as they don't have too many pills left. Anya responds by wondering why he did it, wanting to believe that people's worst moments don't make them monsters, even in his case. I promise this will make sense later. Right after, the crew finally decides to look at the cargo they are shipping, and we find out that they are hauling mouthwash. Mouthwash that isn't even effective because the sugar levels are too high. This absurdity is one piece of the game's critique on capitalism, as the company's refusal to invest in proper safety measures risks the lives of the crew, all to carry something as trivial as mouthwash. Further than that though, we see that even before the crash, our crew is feeling this pressure about their career. Curly, the captain, hallucinates this pit of blood with broken ladders, and with a conversation right after, we find out it represents how he feels trapped at the top of the corporate ladder. He's successful, sure. Does that mean he has to stay the same for the rest of his working life? We see this throughout the rest of the crew too. Swansea continues to try and do his job, even after both crashing and receiving the news that the parent company has gone bankrupt and that everyone has been fired. The reaction of the crew to that news tells us that none of them are in great situations financially. Hell, it took 2 months after crashing to finally look at what they're hauling, out of fear of pay deduction. Even after literally crashing in outer space, their finances are still at the front of their mind. And the further we get into the game, the more the psychological pressure of isolation weighs on the crew. Jimmy especially seems to be suffering from the extra responsibility he needs to take as the captain, needing to do the more general tasks of managing the ship, like finding the code scanner to open the cargo hold, or chopping up the foam to reach extra pills. So when Anya once again asks him to give Curly his painkillers, he snaps at her, yelling about having to do everything on the ship, and practically shoves the pills down Curly's throat. With the food almost running out, the crew starts resorting to the mouthwash, Swansea especially drinking it to the point of being wasted, and this is the point where the game starts to really pick up its intensity. We cut into a scene 6 hours before Judgment, whatever that may mean, and Swansea is chasing Jimmy with an axe. Next scene, we find that Anya has locked herself into the medbay with no intention to open the door, repeating what she said before about people's worst moments not making them monsters, and this being the best moment she'll ever have. Jimmy and Daisuke rush to try and get in there in fear she will harm Curly, but the only way in is through a vent in a utility room, which Swansea is guarding with his life. So Jimmy comes up with the idea of drugging him to get past, and as we get into the utility room they find the cryopods, 3 of the 4 being fully foamed up, and Jimmy seems to realize why Swansea was not allowing anyone in here. When in there though, Daisuke gets heavily injured trying to reach Anya through the busted up vent. But before we see the results of that, we get an important conversation between Curly and Anya, revealing that Anya is pregnant, and it's implied that Jimmy is the father. And with more context, like Anya being genuinely scared of Jimmy and wanting to hide the gun from him, it's implied that this wasn't consensual. But before you get the time to make this connection, Swansea decides to put Daisuke out of his misery, bringing us into the final act of this game. Jimmy finally gets into the medbay, where he finds Anya with a bottle of pills in her hand and the gun hidden underneath Curly. And as Swansea charges down the hallway, it's only Jimmy and Curly left. The next scene reveals that all this time it wasn't actually Curly who crashed the ship, rather it was Jimmy who took everyone down, not wanting to deal with the consequences of his crimes to Anya, nor with the fact that he was fired. From here, the scenes become more and more repulsive, with Jimmy having set up everyone at the table as he slowly puts the knife to Curly's leg, while rambling his delusions. As we cut away from the table, Jimmy enters a vent and hallucinates Daisuke in between the fans, where as Jimmy continues, we see his consciousness basically scream at him to take responsibility. There's no turning back now, but Jimmy is too afraid and quite literally runs away backwards from it as we fall into Swansea's final moment. This is represented as Swansea chasing us with the axe through a graveyard, and as you shoot him we get his final monologue, a raw description of his life as he spent his entire youth being drunk until he saw the light and tried to be a better man. He went to college, got a mortgage and a credit card, hoping he could raise his children to be better people than he was, never wanting to be one setback away from his worst. But the truth was that sobriety and the accomplishments he was chasing never felt as good as he expected, only resulting in a hollow feeling and the finish line moving further along. Now that he's here in his final moments, those nights spinning out of his head, sinking into the sofa with broken glass in his palm, seemed to be the best he ever had. Capitalist dream of being rich and always striving for more, leaving him with a feeling of wasting his life away for some made-up goal as he's stuck in this routine of discipline, always trying to prove his worth in this world. He's got nothing to hide now. He can see himself for what he is, as he brings his attention back to Jimmy, a cowardly, selfish motherfucker. Can't even see how wrong he really is. Jimmy doesn't like this and tells him he's going to fix it, that they're going to make it, as he slowly aims the gun at his head. As he leaves Swansea in the utility room, Jimmy progresses through a hallway that contorts with Curly staring at him until he finally reaches through. In this scene, Jimmy very generously feeds Curly with the only food he has left, that being the leg he cut off of him, as we have to adjust his insides for the food to flow through his body and reach his digestion system. When we turn to the TV, Jimmy hallucinates a conversation with Curly, in which he still refuses to accept that it's over, trying to convince himself he can fix this and that they can both be seen as heroes. And the way Jimmy will try to save their legacy is by putting Curly into the final cryopod, his final moments still echoing his delusions and twisted sense of responsibility, proclaiming that he fixed it, as he turns the gun he killed Swansea with on himself. And as Curly freezes into the next 20 years, you are left staring into nothingness. Curly most likely never going to be rescued, as Jimmy really only prolonged his fate. Story laid out though, we can look a bit deeper into its horrors and its anti-capitalist message, especially through its more surreal scenes. I already slightly talked about the one scene with Curly showing his fear that he'll be stuck forever in this same cycle on this same ladder, but throughout the game we see most of these hallucinatory scenes from the perspective of Jimmy. Like the scene where he finds out they're only transporting mouthwash, and he finds a TV with capitalist propaganda showing the dream job where the workers get actual benefits and time off for their family, the only thing necessary being the profit of the company. When that is achieved, everyone will thrive. The TV also shows videos about the universe and atoms, representing how he feels insignificant and as just another cog of the machine. We also see Jimmy directly hallucinate the company's mascot as this monster as it chases him throughout the intro of the game, restricting his movement through the halls, or in the shape of a giant floating head looking down upon him as he's finding disaffected for daisuke, or even as this misformed caterpillar chasing him down the halls, in which I assume to be him running away from the consequences of his actions, the company representing an authority finding out about his crime. But Mouthwashing's critique of capitalism is not only portrayed through these metaphorical horror scenes, we also see it in the characters' relationship, especially with Jimmy's mindset about the hierarchy. Him putting a big emphasis on being worth your title, that being the reason he demotes Curly from captain, and he uses this to explicitly dehumanize Anya when she can't bring herself to give Curly the painkillers, as he belittles her and questions her competence. Because for Jimmy, a title isn't just a role, but a measure of value, where anyone who doesn't meet this arbitrary standard of his isn't worth his respect, or even being treated as a human being. And he uses this to manipulate both Anya and Daisuke. Near the end of the game, he almost realizes that he's wrong. He teeters on the edge of self-awareness, then reframes it as his own failure to manage the extra responsibility he took upon himself. Rather than taking responsibility for his actions, he blames it on him just being a bad captain, as if that was the only thing he did wrong. We can see in the last act he no longer refers to himself as captain, rather he has given back that role to Curly. But however horrific the reality of capitalism might be, the true horror from Mouthwashing comes from the character you play as most, Jimmy. And more specifically, his actions and how he refuses to acknowledge that he's wrong in the case of Anya. His actions throughout the game are awful against everyone, but especially with Anya. Now, Jimmy is a so-called unreliable narrator, which means that from his point of view, his actions are set up to be less bad. But we still see him just be incredibly disrespectful to Anya, and from the scenes from Curly POV, we see that it is so much worse than that, as that is where we get the reveal that he raped her. This is the action that kicks off most of the story of the game, as her being pregnant from this is what ultimately sets him off to crash the ship, as he desperately tries to avoid the consequence of his own actions. The realization of this recontextualizes all our previous scenes with Anya and Jimmy. Suddenly her telling Jimmy she wants to believe their worst moments don't make them monsters makes more sense. Her flinching from Jimmy just saying hello is explained, and even the conversation she had with Curly about a random dead pig on this big screen makes more sense now. It's stuck in the back of her mind forever. While she will never be able to get rid of the trauma, Curly is unable to see it, as he is just looking at the bigger picture. When she told him the first time, he confronted Jimmy, but didn't hold him to any consequences, wanting to solve it without officially reporting it to help his and Jimmy's career in the long run. Even when Anya told him she was pregnant, he doesn't really do anything about it, rather he just tries to talk it out with Jimmy, who then goes and crashes the ship, trying to escape underneath the pressure of his own creation. Curly failed Anya as a captain, but it is of course Jimmy who doesn't want to take responsibility. Or rather, this is his twisted way of taking responsibility. Just before he crashes the ship, he tells Curly he'll take care of it. He truly thinks this is the best solution. He thinks he's doing the best for Curly and himself, as if this would come out back on Earth, they would most likely both lose everything they have worked for. This is him trying to take responsibility for how his actions will affect Curly. But it isn't even taking responsibility. Rather, his sense of responsibility comes from a place of avoidance instead of accountability, which we can see throughout the entire game with almost all of his actions, as he supposedly carries the tasks of others on his shoulder, desperately trying to convince himself that he can fix this, while actively lying to everyone on the ship by blaming Curly, never accepting that he fucked up and everyone here will die because of him. He manipulates Daisuke to do the dangerous tasks by telling him this will gain the respect of the rest, playing into his desire to be recognized. He treats Swansea like a useless alcoholic, even though he is the only one who sees through his delusions, directly calling him out on his bullshit throughout the game until even the final words of his life. His relationship with Anya is by far the worst in the game, which we can see in one way through the guilt sequences. With every single member of the crew, something within him knows he's wrong, even going as far as begging for forgiveness from Curly. Except for Anya. We never see Jimmy show anything but complaints and insults. Nothing inside of him can summon even the tiniest bit of humanity to feel guilty for Anya. The only surreal scene we see somewhat related to Anya is a disformed echo scan, showing how the only thing he feels guilty for is the consequences that he has to face because of what he did to her. Replaying this game with the knowledge of the first playthrough makes it arguably more horrific. Every small interaction between Anya and Jimmy reeks of this horrific action, and throughout the entirety of its 2 hours runtime, its presence looms over the game. This game has some fantastic horror, whether that be through its sound design, body horror, or even just the anxiety that surrounds a lot of the scenes in the game. On your first playthrough, you'll find plenty to be disturbed of even before the reveal that Anya was raped. But the moment that realization hits, this game transforms from a story that I thought would be about cabin fever and responsibility to a story about rape, and the horror that it derives from that won't leave your head, like when the nasty sound effect stops, or when you finally succeed in feeding Curly his leg, or even when the credits roll. I've been Shilsey, and thank you so much for watching.